Hi guys, and welcome to a tutorial where we're going to be looking at different stitch types that can be used on a fursuit head. Firstly, something I'd like to sort of let you guys know about is I have relaunched my Patreon. I really want to provide you guys with a lot more content in 2018, and this is the best way for me to do it. I've rewritten all of my tier rewards because I know I messed up last time and I promised things I couldn't really promise. But this way, I really hope to be able to give you guys a lot more exclusive content, early access content, daily work in progress pictures, all those sorts of things that everybody else doesn't get to see, that I'd like to provide to my Patreons in return for your support for my work and my videos. Thank you so much, guys. I will leave that link down in the the description box. Please take a look at it. Please come and see if you can support my work, and if you can, it'll help me provide a lot more for you guys in the near future. Thank you. Now, in front we have 4 pieces of fleece, which are in white, and I'm going to be stitching on these in black. I've got a control, which is just machine sewn through, and the other 3 I'm going to be teaching you 3 different stitch types that are commonly used in fursuit building. This is the control. Obviously you can see I'm using black thread on white fabric so that you can see the thread. The first stitch we're going to be looking at is the whip stitch. This is very simple, very fast, very easy, but it's not necessarily the neatest or tightest stitch for most applications. The second is my personal favourite, the blanket stitch. It's very similar to the whip stitch, but it just features a little bit more strength, and it's a little bit more uniform, looks a little bit better from the other side. Finally, the ladder stitch. This can be used to sew up openings in suit tails, to sew on hair onto the head. Bunch of different applications for this I'm going to go through later. I'm going to show you both the right way and the commonly used wrong way of doing this particular stitch. So the first stitch we're going to be looking at is the whip stitch. This is the most simple of stitches. You literally start by putting your thread into the fabric, tying it off nice and tight, and then all you do is go round and round the seam with the thread. So you can see exactly what I'm doing, just putting the needle through the fabric, and out the other side, and then back in the other side, and then back out, like a whip, I suppose. The best way to get a good whip stitch is to pull the thread nice and tight, make sure all of the stitches are a good even distance apart, and make sure that distance is quite small. As I've said, this isn't the neatest of the stitches we're going to be going over today, but I know a lot of fursuit builders use this on the seams in the head because the stitch isn't terribly strong itself, but you don't need that strength when you're going to be gluing all of the fur to the head anyway. It's nice and fast, it does the job, and that's all you really need to know, to be honest. Anything structural, I would not recommend this stitch, but something just to keep the fabric together where it's being glued, it does work and do the job for most people. I'm just going to take you guys around to look at the other side, which will be the front-facing side of the seam. And I mean, it's a little bit worse because I'm using black thread on white, but you can see that the stitches are not hidden very well, they're a little bit uneven, and just for most applications, this stitch isn't ideal. So now we're going to move on to the blanket stitch. This is my particular favourite stitch for most applications. I use this anywhere that you could use the whip stitch, but I find it a little bit stronger, a little bit neater from both sides, and generally it just works out a little bit better in the long run. However, it does take a little bit longer to do. So as you can see, this works pretty much exactly the same as the whip stitch, but when you loop your thread around and put your needle back through the fabric, what you want to do is put that needle back through the loop as well. So in effect, this ties off the stitch. Exactly the same as when you tie a nice simple knot. It does the same thing, but on the outside of the stitch, and this locks that stitch into place. It locks the amount of fabric and the tension of the fabric that's being pulled, like, with the stitch at the time, and it looks so much better than the whip stitch, but does the same job. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish this line of stitching the same way, but exactly the same as the whip stitch. You're going to try and have to keep those stitches nice and uniform, nice and close together. And if you can keep the thread that you're tying off on the same side of the fabric, that just generally helps with the overall neatness of the stitch itself. Like with any stitch, you're just going to want to tie this off the end with a couple of nice tight knots. just to stop it from unraveling. I'm going to flip over this fabric now that I'm done and just show you guys how much of a difference it makes just locking each of your stitches in a blanket stitch instead of the whip stitch. You can see they're a lot smaller, they're a lot more difficult to see, and compared to the machine stitching either side of it, it really doesn't look too bad at all. And this is worst case scenario using black thread on white fabric with no fur pile to hide the stitches. Finally, we're going to take a look at the ladder stitch. This is most commonly used when you're trying to sew up something that you've just stuffed, where you need to sew it from the outside but hide the stitches on the inside. So it's also applicable when you're sewing something onto a head, like maybe a tuft of hair or the ears. I'm going to show you a couple of applications at the end that I've recently used this for. And you're going to want to start your thread on the inside of the gap. This way the knot that you've tied off can be hidden on the inside of the piece that you're sewing up. Loop your thread around one side of the fabric close to the edge and tie your knot this way so that the thread doesn't just slip through when you start pulling your stitches nice and tight. I'm going to show you this as best as I can, so you need to start on one side of the fabric, put your needle in and then pull it back out again parallel to the cut edge of the fabric. So you don't want to go across that cut of fabric that you've just made, you want to go along the same direction as it. And you're going to want to do one side at a time, not both sides of the fabric in one loop of thread. So again, we're going to go from one side to the other, moving the thread in the direction of the gap that we're trying to sew up, parallel to that gap. If you use nice small uniform stitches, just like previously, it should hide up that gap really well, and hide all the stitches inside the fabric when you pull it nice and tight. What I'm showing you now is the incorrect way of doing this, which is what a lot of people do, where instead of going parallel to the gap that you're trying to sew up, you just go straight across. So in one side of the fabric, out the gap, in that side of the next fabric, and back out the other side. What this does is creates a bumpy ridge in the fabric that kind of just doesn't look all that great. You can go perpendicular to the gap by going from outside in, or inside out, inside out. But when you go straight across, you just create this really unsightly looking seam that doesn't look very great. And now just to tie that one off there, so we can take a look at this stitch, both doing it right and wrong, and see what works and why. What I should have done here is showed you the correct way to tie off this thread. So once you've tied it together, what you then should do is put your thread, your needle back in where that stitching was tied off, and then pull it out a little bit farther away from the seam itself. This way you can snip it off from the outside, and then the extra loose threads end up inside, and that's hidden much better instead of just cutting it from the outside and then you've got a couple of little loose threads dangling. So now I'm going to show you some examples of where I've used these stitches. All of the seams on my suit heads, I use the blanket stitch, but a lot of people do use the whip stitch. I mean, that's a little bit interchangeable, I just prefer the blanket stitch even though it takes a little bit longer. Along this hairline I use the ladder stitch to add the hair afterwards, and around the mouth area and the nose area I tend to use the ladder stitch to secure the fur to the fleece lining of the mouth. After I've furred the rest of the head, I should make clear. And just to take a look at this tail here, this is the gap where I didn't sew the tail up before I finished it. I turned it right side out, stuffed it, and then used the ladder stitch on this seam at the end. And that's the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed learning about a few different types of stitching used for the suit head. I did ask for some opinions on what sort of things you guys would like to see. If you've got any suggestions for videos, please leave them in the comments below. And I really hope to be able to bring you guys some more videos soon.